Welcome, everybody. I'm going to ask each person to mute themselves unless it's your turn to talk. And I welcome everybody. We have a small group today, but it's good to see each one of you. We're going to start with our Torah learning blessing. I think everybody's familiar with it. We're going to end La'asok b'divrei Torah. You can actually unmute for this so we can hear each other in a cacophony of prayer. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav, v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Thank you for the inspiration to immerse ourselves, to soak in lifelong learning. Amen. And there's Iris Newman. Welcome. We just said our Torah prayer. And there's Wendy. So people are still coming in here. Good. Wendy, are you all connected there? Are you connected, Wendy? Hi. Welcome.
Hi.
Hi. We just said our Torah prayer and we're getting started here. And we should be recording. Can anybody see if, yeah, we are recording. Wonderful. Okay, so I want to start today by asking, has anybody had any further reflections between the last class and this one about what we talked about last time? Just want to make a space for that. Or questions that you want to make sure we get to before the end of this, which is our last session in this series on Ukraine. Open space here.
I have a lot of confusion now, frankly, between what I read and what I see and what you have presented before us. I have one question after another. And what are we doing in Ukraine? It's really becoming a worry for me.
Thank you for sharing that, Beverly. Do you want to say anything else about that? Thank you for sharing that. So we've complexified the waters, right? We've complexified the waters here. Iris Newman.
I am very happy that my ancestors left Ukraine and came to this country. And we're happy here and not dead.
Thank you. Anybody else? Okay, my usual question, who was able to watch? I think this time it was watching 3 different links, but let's start with the one that was Medea Benjamin, the first 15 minutes. Who was able to watch that? Wonderful. And then there were a couple more links. Who was able to delve into them? Wow, Wendy, you get the gold star there for today. And as usual, we're still using our book, The War in Ukraine, Making Sense of a Senseless Conflict, throughout all of these sessions. And also we're using our Jewish framing of peace values, which today we're going to circle back to, because we're looking at these choices that are in front of the world and in front of our United States leaders, through the Jewish values that we've been lifting up. And we've been widening the lens on the mainstream's Cold War perspective on Ukraine. So, and anybody else have a question you want to make sure we cover or touch on at least before we end our series? Anybody else have? Welcome, Ellen Zilka.
Hi, good morning.
See you there. Any other questions for the moment? Okay, so this is our kind of framing quote, and I'm going to ask people to lift up each side of this with some examples from what we've talked about so far. The war in Ukraine was entirely preventable through criminality and stupidity on the Kremlin side. and severe provocation on the US side. We are where we are. So let's just have three examples of from what we've been reading in the news and talking about what's three examples of criminality and stupidity from the Kremlin side, from Putin's side. Three examples, just zip, like a sentence or less each.
The terrible atrocities. To pick photos that we see in papers every day of bodies all over. It's like killing indiscriminately and these residential dwellings are decimated. Where do the people come back to? Nothing. It's dreadful.
I'm going to count that as two, Beverly. Indiscriminate killing and destruction of infrastructure. Yes. And does somebody else want to?
Thanks. You?
Good. Yes, Drew.
I think there was a massive miscalculation on the part of the Kremlin as to how easy a campaign this would be, and that they thought they would be in and out, sort of like our in and out in a couple of days, and it would be over, and that the Ukrainians would capitulate.
Yeah. Massive miscalculation. And then in the face of that, escalation. Like rather than saying, whoops, we miscalculated, this isn't the moment, we'll have to work this out some other way. Escalation and further aggression, right? Really, yeah. Okay, and then let's look at the other side that we've been talking about. Severe provocation on the US side, mostly through NATO, but also in some ways directly. Severe provocation on the US side. Three examples.
Just willingness to send our arms and money, how many billions we've sent to them. We not encouraged it, but we certainly facilitated much of the war. Yes.
Well over $1 billion at this point, and at the G7 still pouring forth from the United States. Yes. What else is severe provocation over the history that we've talked about?
Breaking all of our nuclear agreements.
Mm-hmm. Yep. What else? One more. Okay, I'll add in the creep eastward to Russia's borders of NATO, despite assurances and agreements that there would not be 1 inch eastward. And explicitly crossing red lines that Russia repeatedly laid out that this would be not okay. Severe provocation. So that's what we're looking at. And so today, we're going to go back to some of the Jewish peace values that we started with. And you have two different texts of Jewish peace values. I might be able to drop them again into the chat. Yes, I just put them. I know some people can use the chat box and some people can't, but I just put them again, and they're also in the material sent out for this class, but I just put them. I'm not sure one of these links came through in the chat box, but one of them did. But it's in your material with both links. Jewish peace values. Actually, the one that I don't think came through as a link when I cut and pasted it. For some reason, some links don't translate well into the chat box. In the Seek Peace and Pursue It, one of the key Jewish texts given is the quote about Aaron was a man of peace and a pursuer of peace. We talked about it in our first class. Why does it say twice? He was not only a man of peace, he was a pursuer of peace. And we collectively decided that's because those are two different things. You can be a peaceful human being and not be a pursuer of peace. And the Jewish value with the model of our ancestor Aaron, Moses's brother, Miriam's brother, is to pursue peace. And so we're going to be asking ourselves, what would that mean? What would it mean to pursue peace in this situation? You also have in these peace texts many, many more Jewish references, quotes, lots more discussion about Jewish peace values, including that one name for God is shalom. Literally a name for God, for like ultimate wholeness and harmony, is shalom, peace. So we know this is central to what it even means to be Jewish and to bring these values into the wider world. So what's going on? Like, why isn't there any movement at the moment towards peace? Now, in the course of these sessions, we've looked at how the very top leaders within the US military and State Department are saying the only way to stop this war is through the negotiating table. It could drag out for decades, but you're going to have to sit at the negotiating table sooner or later. So why aren't we sitting at the negotiating table? Now, one example that was shared by somebody in your watching and reading, I think it was shared by Medea Benjamin, which many of you lived through, is coming back again to the Bay of Pigs, which was the same situation in reverse. It was the Soviet Union at the doorstep on the border of the United States, threatening with weapons. It's very similar to why Russia is concerned about NATO expanding right to its doorstep. And in the Bay of Pigs situation, JFK, who was president at the time, negotiated with Khrushchev, who was in charge of the Soviet Union. But at the time, the American public was not told about negotiations. Isn't that interesting? Like we've talked about how much spin and blustering and people playing to the political requirements of the moment, like trying to look like they have a fierce foreign policy because of some domestic political situation. And at the time of the Bay of Pigs, the American public didn't know that actually JFK and Khrushchev were in fact negotiating, not just bullying back and forth and escalating. It was a very, very dangerous moment for the world. And the United States, which the public did not know at the time, for its side of the negotiation, had to remove nuclear weapons from Turkey. And the Soviet Union had to withdraw from Cuba, whatever was threatening the United States.
But we traded them.
It was a negotiation where everybody got something and everybody gave something. And it was a very, very dangerous moment. But that's how those leaders got out of it. The Soviet Union got out of its position in Cuba. And afterwards, President JFK wrote that in the age of nuclear weapons, you do not want to push your opposition into a humiliating corner. And that was what was the driving kind of DNA of JFK in his approach to that very dangerous moment. Do not push your opposition into a humiliating corner. It kind of makes psychological sense, right? Like in an age of nuclear capacity to literally destroy humankind on the entire face of the earth, you don't want to push your opponent into a situation where their only option at that point is to push that button. So that was the advice coming from the very similar episode, but in reverse, is you're going to have to negotiate, and both sides have to give and get in a negotiation. So again, we're going to ask, why haven't there been negotiations? Now, it's very possible there are some kind of back channel something, but clearly they are not being effective enough yet, because there hasn't been any kind of peace agreement. So if there even is anything like that, we just don't know. We'll know when the Memoirs and Freedom of Information Act opens everything up many years from now. We don't truly know, but it's likely some people are trying something back channel, but it hasn't been effective enough yet, as we can see. I want to welcome Joe, and I want to also welcome Debbie. And our iPhone person here is Ellen Zilka. And Paul and Phil have come in since we first began. So we're kind of in it now, folks, but everybody is very welcome. So We understand that the only way to peace is through the negotiating table. It's very unlikely anybody's going to win this war, including we heard a quote from the a very high-ranking general in the chief of staffs, the key advisory, the Joint Chief of Staff Advisory Group. That's the top military advisory group to the United States government, saying the only way to, out of this is through the negotiating table. So are we going to negotiate sooner or later? Now, we see that negotiations haven't happened. So we're going to ask the question today, what is stopping the key parties from being willing to negotiate? So let's do a little check-in right here. What would stop you at this moment, if you were in charge of this, from negotiating? What might be going through your mind if you were choosing, let's say as President Biden, let's say you're President Biden? Why would you not? I mean, there's several key parties here. There's Zelensky, there's Putin, and then there's the United States. Because, well, let me just do this check-in first. Let's say you're Biden. Why wouldn't you negotiate right now? Or like succeed at negotiating? Put yourself in those shoes, and what are some reasons that you might choose, I don't want to do this? And I'm just going to frame it. You know that you can't win militarily. They all know that. Everybody knows it at this point. It's not a secret.
I think it's a popular war.
It's a popular war.
Yes, yes. I think we Americans, by and large, for the most part, approve of our support for Ukraine. It's a popular war.
It's a popular war, and I think that extends to popular with Republicans and Democrats.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes.
So that might be a reason you wouldn't negotiate, because you're playing to the American voters more than thinking about death and destruction in somewhere else. Iris, did you have your hand up? And then I also see Ed.
Go ahead.
Okay, Ed.
Yeah, well, there's dissent against this popularity of the war, but it's dissent coming from Republican legislators in Congress. And I think that our intense partisan divide kind of presents the flexibility we need to exercise.
Yeah, so this may yet become an election issue. And in general, these things are very polarized. So it may be that this war is less popular as time goes by and more polarized even than it is right now, where it's sort of a minority. But you can see people are kind of stirring that pot of the politics in this country around the war. Thank you, Ed. Teresa, you can unmute.
Hi, everybody. Hi, Julie. I think from what I hear, it's the military industrial complex, like these military companies, that money goes to them and they're making a lot of money. And now that Afghanistan is over, they have a chance to make money.
Yeah.
And they supply Congress with donations, let's say.
Yeah. That's a huge piece of the puzzle, is the military industrial complex and who actually funds the politicians who are making the decisions. Joe.
I've read some things that there's a concern, I guess, maybe amongst the United States, Britain, other countries that are helping Ukraine, and maybe Ukraine itself too, that if a truce or a peace treaty is worked on or even agreed to, what will keep the Russians from, let's say, sometime down the road attacking again? So the idea of coming up with some type of treaty that will be satisfactory to the US, other allies, and Ukraine itself, that Russia won't come back a few years from now and attack again.
Okay. Okay. Well, next question. What do you think NATO, because I mean, I guess it would be the two immediate adversaries who are sitting at a negotiating table, but clearly these other players are very, very relevant to the outcome of the negotiations. So what would NATO have to give up to do its side of the negotiation? Just like the United States had to give up nuclear weapons in Turkey. Debbie.
I think that was the whole premise for Putin's getting into the war, to stop the spread of NATO. And just the opposite has happened. I think you explained that in the last class, which, by the way, I saw on YouTube. I love that we can do that. But so I think what they would have to give up is inclusivity of other countries that Russia's afraid will include.
So NATO would have to give up having Ukraine in NATO, which NATO never really actually wanted until this moment anyway. It would definitely have to give that up. And it would probably have to give up. Does anyone else have some ideas? Yeah, Drew.
Well, in addition to not expanding the NATO territories, what's happening is in the Russian attempt to grab land, if it's all or part of Ukraine, is that they are closing in and putting their weapons closer to NATO territory. So that's something NATO has to do, either concede or fight.
Yeah, so, and in fact, maybe both sides would need to sort of back up where the nuclear weapons are stationed and allowed to be, like just separate themselves from each other's borders more.
Well, there's less of a neutral territory in separating the forces as NATO expands east and Russia tries to expand closer to continental Europe.
Right. So there might have to be some new agreements about that. Yeah. What do you think Zelensky would have to give up to negotiate?
Oh, boy.
Territory.
Yeah, I was going to say some land, which I can't picture them doing.
Yeah, well, we have seen in our brief study of the history of the situation that Russia took over territory that had historically been Russian, where Russian leaders voted to be part of Russia. So it's kind of complex, but it's true. Russia invaded, it was illegal, and it's not the way we should be solving our disputes. So you're saying Zelensky might have to let go of that and not get all of Ukraine back, and that you think that would be really hard for Zelensky.
I have a question. Historically, how was Russia able to take over Crimea? There wasn't a war.
It was a kind of invasion. I mean, it was technically covered by a referendum where the people voted to join Russia.
People of Crimea voted.
They voted to join Russia, but of course, there was tons of monkey trouble going on both sides there, like literally assassinations and people, it wasn't necessarily fair on any leader's side. There was lots of, it's covered actually in the book in a lot of depth, but
well, apparently half of the population, or half of the population of Ukraine speaks Russian.
Yeah.
And so there is some, ambivalent feelings. Maybe some Ukrainians would not mind again returning to Russia, etc. And then, of course,
right. I mean, a lot of people in those regions wanted to be part of Russia. They saw themselves as part of Russia. They historically had always been part of Russia. They probably have relatives in the rest of Russia,
Yeah.
So it's kind of funny because when you just draw a national border, it doesn't necessarily mean that's how humans live. Like humans are on both sides of the border, the same families, and it's the same thing in certain other parts of the world that have those situations. But yeah, so you're saying Zelensky would have to give up some land, and that would not be easy because obviously Zelensky has a different position and interest. And what about the United States? How could the United States, what the United States have to do to move towards peace? I mean, let's sort of think about the inputs for this war. Right? One input is all the resources pouring in, and something's going to shift when those resources stop pouring in. And the major pourer inner of resources is the United States. Right? All these hundreds of millions of dollars. And so what is something the United States could do to sort of push people towards peace, towards negotiation? Paul.
Well, it's interesting because just the other day, we're going the opposite direction when we're giving these fighter jets and training Ukrainians. So we're going the
Yes,
opposite.
yeah.
We could say, wouldn't this be great? And already Putin has said this escalates from his side because he now knows that with these more powerful jets, you know, the Ukrainians could enter into Russia and start bombing if they want to, or they will absolutely intercept whatever is coming their way from the airspace, which they couldn't before. And that created, even in Kyiv, it created more destruction. So I think, you know, we can talk about what it is, but we are, for some reason, after what, the better part of a year plus, by not giving them this major firepower, and we already gave them the Patriot systems, which are shooting down their, you know, their missiles, which, and they didn't think that would be. They thought their missiles were impervious to other weaponry. So we're escalating just by increasing our military hardware that is coming fast and furious to Ukraine. So I mean, I like the discussion, but I just have to say one more thing. It's like, if you even look at someone like DeSantis in Florida, who says, "I won't back down," and that's his campaign slogan. I think Putin has the same slogan. So we can hope and wish and behind the scenes, but this is one of those people that, you know, took and went in and, you know, doesn't seem to care that we want them to sit down together. So that's just my take. I don't want to be negative about it, because there's always the hope of, but this person basically came in and took what wasn't his, gave his people so much propaganda to understand that, yes, we're on the right side. So it's tricky. You know, I think the one thing we could do in some positive way is to infiltrate their media with other communication, just so people might have more understanding of what's really going on. So, but yeah, the military is deeply entrenched now to a point where we almost have to just watch and see what happens, because Putin ain't happy with our new decisions.
Thank you, Paul. Phil.
Yeah, I just want to add to what Paul said, because the thing that happened in the Bay of Pigs is we had to find a way for Khrushchev to save face.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why Turkey happened. And this time too, not only do we have to have Putin have a way of saving face, but also Zelensky, who has said we won't give up an inch, blah, 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 blah. He's got to have a way of answering to his people. You know, why are we bargaining away anything?
Yeah.
So that makes it all very, very difficult.
When we lost so many lives and so much
Not
of
an
our
easy situation, and we must keep those industrial, the military industrial people that Teresa has mentioned, the profit factor there with this new round of military hardware, because just a few months ago, Biden said, no, that would really escalate. It would threaten Russia to the point of no return. We're never going to do that. And now we're doing it. So, you know, we don't know all the inner workings, but so let's go back. So let's circle back to the question then. Okay, so we don't see any effective negotiations happen. So somebody has an interest in not making this work out. And I'm going to bring a resource in from, it's actually a good friend of mine, Rebecca Subar, who has an advanced degree from Harvard and now goes back there and teaches, who wrote a book last year called When to Talk and When to Fight, which is exactly this assessment, that each leader who has power in this situation is assessing when to talk and when to fight. And clearly they've so far resolved to fight, because they're fighting. We haven't seen a successful alternative unrolling. And in this book, Rebecca talks about an analysis of power that helps get you to your decision about when to talk and when to fight. So let's see. I'm going to open up my notes on it here. I talked with Rebecca last night, and I asked Rebecca to think through what was happening in Ukraine and Russia based on her power analysis of when you talk and when you fight. And she wrote to me, Ukraine and Russia seem matched power-wise when you consider that with all the resources each side has access to, neither seems able to win. That puts them both in good positions to make a deal. So, okay, yet neither is seriously moving towards negotiation. Why is that? And she's saying with power balanced, they could negotiate, but instead they are both continuing to take unilateral action in order to prevail over the other. They both fancy themselves as liberators of their own people. So let's think about that for a minute. We know Zelensky sees himself as the liberator of his own people from the big bully, Russia. Can you also imagine that Putin sees himself as the liberator of his own people in Ukraine? Can we picture that? And as the protector of his own people in Russia against the threat of these weapons that are at his doorstep. So they both see themselves, Rebecca's suggesting, as liberators. They both fancy themselves liberators of their own people. And then Rebecca goes on to say, as abhorrent as that theory is, two fighters in a ring trying to knock each other out does make some strategic sense if both have the goal of prevailing. It's hideous morally, but comprehensible strategically. So the question is, why do they both think they can win when the world basically doesn't think they can win? Any expert on the issue doesn't think either side can win militarily. Okay, so in this country, most people think, you know, Russia's the oppressor and Russia's the invader and the aggressor, and that really Ukraine doesn't want to challenge Russia. It just wants its own territory back. So why wouldn't then, in that case, still, why are we stuck with neither side being willing to negotiate? Possibly Ukraine perceives Russia as more powerful. And then Ukraine would rather resolve the fight and negotiate. But since Russia has more power, Ukraine doesn't think it could really get a good deal, because if they see Russia as more powerful, they won't think they can get a good deal by negotiating. So they're resisting. They see themselves as the weaker power, choosing an approach to keep resisting. This is a possibility, just one of many that we're going to look at here. So if you think about it, you know, game theory, where you don't know what the other player is going to do, like what kind of decisions do you make when you don't know what the other player in the game is going to do? Ukraine doesn't know what Russia's thinking. Russia doesn't know the inside of what Ukraine is thinking. So it's possible that Ukraine sees itself as weaker than Russia, and so not in a good position to negotiate because it won't get what it wants at the negotiating table. You pretty much need equal power to get a good negotiation. Now, a lot of world leaders think they have equal power, because with the United States pouring all these resources into Ukraine, there's a lot of, you know, might there that matches Russia's might, and Russia has a lot of it in their own territory. So that's one possibility. And did somebody have something to say? Teresa, I saw your hand up, and Joe, but I have a couple other things that are possibilities too.
I was just going to ask if you knew that was true that they said since 2014 in the Donbass, they've been fighting and the Ukrainians killed a lot of Russians. And so like the Azov battalion was real brutal to the Russians.
Yeah.
And I know that was like before you talked, but do the Russians feel that? Like, do they feel that like that Ukrainians were being too mean to the Russians in that country? Is that part of it as well, Julie?
Like, did they see themselves as the victim and the abused party in this case?
Yes.
I mean, that's a good question. And some of those things had been resolved through the Minsk I and Minsk II agreements, especially Minsk II in 2014, I believe. But things have kind of unraveled and gone from bad to worse since then. But yeah, I think people in relationships have an enormous capacity to each person to see themselves as the victim. And that obviously goes true for nation states too. I mean, don't we usually see how the other person is, at fault, to blame, the problem? And we see ourselves as kind of morally pure and wounded and getting the worst end of the stick. So Teresa, I think you're probably right about that. Joe.
I was just going to say that Russia might not like being told by the U.S. via U.S.'s help of Ukraine to back out of there. From the standpoint of Russia could be saying, well, the United States went into Iraq and they said there were these weapons of mass destruction, and it turned out there weren't. So the U.S. went in there because they felt like it. Well, if the U.S. can do something militarily because they feel like it, why can't we? Or maybe certainly we don't want to be told by the person who does what they feel like doing militarily that we can't do what we want to do militarily. So that's something that could come into play.
Right. Sort of, it's not fair. You can't boss me around. We're an equal world power. Okay, so what could be keeping these folks from negotiating? Maybe it's that Ukraine perceives that it can't get a good deal because it sees Russia as more powerful, so they're just going to fight it out. And then maybe if this just keeps going on and they're just perennially fighting each other, but they don't actually really want to vanquish each other. That's not in anybody's interest, actually, to destroy the other one. They both actually prefer to end this war. So they could negotiate a stop to the fighting right now, since they're fairly evenly matched. They could save lives, and they aren't doing that, apparently, in which case, even if there are back channels of negotiation, they apparently haven't tried hard enough yet. Which leaves the prevailing opinion that this is just going to go at each other, even though they could take the opportunity to negotiate. So there must be one reason, there must be at least one of the countries obstructing the negotiation that they actually ultimately are going to want, but they're obstructing it right now and it can't move forward. So possibly Ukraine thinks Russia's more
I'm going down.
possibly Russia. It's
I
possible.
won't be coming down till about 1:15 because I'm listening to a program.
Somebody needs to mute themselves,
Oh.
and I think it's okay. There we go. So it could be that Ukraine doesn't feel powerful enough to win at the negotiating table. On the other hand, it could be that Russia doesn't feel powerful enough because it sees itself as up against the United States. So it could be obstructing. Like if anyone feels weaker, they might have an interest in obstructing a negotiation. Negotiations tend to happen between peers who have about equal power. Like, why would you negotiate if you don't yet think you have equal power? You won't get a very good deal, right? But we don't really know who sees themselves as not having enough power. It might be Russia looking at the United States as its competitor and saying, well, they've clearly got more weapons and wealth than, we're not going to get a good deal if we sit down and we're really negotiating with the United States if we negotiate with Zelensky. Or it could be Ukraine thinking that about Russia. Drew.
It could also, I look at it the opposite way as opposed to the military balance of power, the moral sense of superiority that one side feels that it has to, it has a moral obligation to maintain a position and not compromise.
So Drew, is that the same thing as saying pride? Like one of the leaders has at this point, they're just going to go on a suicide mission because they just will not say enough because of pride. They're not going to back down. Is that the same thing?
Depends which side you're looking at it from.
Do you want to say more? Like how to play that out a little bit?
No, I mean, you're right. Like any negotiation, you have to reach, I think, a certain point of pain to get to the negotiating table or to be willing to compromise enough to get an agreement. It has to be painful enough for you to say, okay, we have to do something different than we're doing now. But in the meantime, I feel morally superior. I feel a moral obligation to maintain this position, and I'm not going to back down until forced.
Yeah. Okay. So you're saying it's reinforcing to the one who's feeling morally superior. It's a reason to not see yourself as a peer negotiator because you're getting something. You're getting nourished and fed by that moral superiority position. Very interesting. Phil.
Thank you. I just want to add to what he said, because I think there's another layer that we haven't talked about, which is the Cold War. It's also a fight between authoritarianism and democracy. And I think both sides feel that issue. And they feel the moral high ground because they believe in their respective philosophies. They believe.
So you're saying there's an ideological element to all this and that people actually believe their own side of it.
Absolutely.
Okay. Well, yeah, so I would put those, what Drew said and what Phil said, in the same category. There's moral superiority, sort of ideological alignment with your own. You think you're right. And so you're not going to go negotiate because you think you're right and you're going to stand for that. Yeah. So another principle in negotiation is something called BATNA. Has anybody ever heard of BATNA? BATNA stands for the best alternative to negotiated agreement. BATNA, best alternative to negotiated agreement. So before people go sit at a negotiating table, they get pretty clear about, if I didn't negotiate, what's my best alternative? So if, let's say it's a union that's trying to decide whether to sit down and negotiate with the boss. And their best alternative is to either keep getting lousy wages or to go on strike. And if they go on strike, there's a big cost to going on strike, but they will have more power. They'll get more power. So they might not decide to sit down at the table. They might decide to do a strike first because they have a pretty good BATNA. The employer has to decide, what's my BATNA? What's my best alternative to sitting here and making a deal with the union? Well, my best alternative might be to hire scab labor and replace the workers, but we'll have a terrible reputation and they won't be trained and it's not really a very good alternative. We want to sit down and work this out with the union. So everyone's kind of assessing their BATNA, their best alternative to negotiation. So if you think about it, what is Zelensky's best alternative to negotiated agreement? As long as he has the United States pouring resources into the country, I don't know. Does he have a better alternative than continuing to fight? Like, our country's policy is key in keeping this going. What's Russia's best alternative to negotiated agreement? Paul?
Well, I think just watching Zelensky going to the G7 and even engaging India, which did not take a position, I think he's looking for his best alternative. He's possibly looking to others who might either broker, like India, they have no positions, no skin in the game so far. But so I think, look, if you have the best, it's very tricky because so far from what I get of Zelensky, he has the best interest of his country. I don't know if Putin does. I'd like to say somewhere in there, if he's a patriot for his country, or he feels he's doing what we talked about, that he would somehow say, do I watch tens of thousands of Russians die, or do I, figure out a way forward? But I do think that Zelensky, watching what he was just doing for some détente with other countries over the last week, he may be searching for that best alternative, because he, it's almost like, but then it's the one thing, yeah. So it's also very tricky because he had already negotiated early on, tried to settle. I remember that, and that wasn't going well with Putin and the Russians. So, it's just, this is all difficult because they're entrenched, and now adding in those jet fighters is not, de-escalating the situation from my perspective.
Yes, it's actually provocative and escalating it. Yeah.
Yes, it
Is
is.
your sense that Zelensky is over there at the G7 trying to find someone to broker peace, or trying to find more infusion of weapons?
It could be both, but I think that by meeting with India, there was something interesting there, because they hadn't, what's his name, Modi had not made a state position before. So that was different than brokering weapons. And that I want to add into the mix, because that's one of those countries that, and recently he had a phone call with Xi in China. So there too, I mean, they may be behind the scenes, these power brokers, which are those BRIC countries, may be able to have that position of speaking to Russia if they're giving them, some kind of, when we're doing the sanctions and they're giving them some kind of support. So, it's almost like.
Point. Yeah. And you can see how these other world leaders can really provide leadership. Like Xi basically said to Putin, don't threaten nuclear weapons. That is not okay.
Yes, you're
and
right.
Putin quieted down about that. And it's possible that people sort of behind the scenes got Modi to the G7, who isn't usually part of that, for this purpose that you're talking about, Paul, because he's not part of that group. So somebody got him there, I mean, with some thought, and wanted him there. So very interesting. Phil.
Yes, and I just want to add to that a lot depends on the degree of ego involved. With these leaders, there's always a degree of it. And if it goes beyond a certain point, the idea of trying to support their country and their countrymen and all that is really diluted. And it's more about being seen as powerful, being recognized as this great, powerful leader, and all that can overpower their patriotism. And that can be true on either side.
Yeah, and also putting that into a more positive channel, somebody who is able to broker peace through negotiations, who's able to bring the parties together, would require a huge amount of global stature. Like, if, I don't know who could do that right now because the world's so polarized, but, potentially someone like India.
Yes.
Modi of India, who knows? But they would love that stature. So it's kind of, and at different times, different leaders, the leader of Turkey, Erdogan, had tried to do something, and, different players have stepped up. But as Jewish people, drawing on the values of how important it is to live and pursue peace, what role do we have? I mean, we're voters. Some of us make donations to things. We can affect public opinion in different ripple affecting ways. What is our responsibility in this situation to pursue peace? Anybody have any thoughts about that? Phil?
Yeah, I have one thought, is that we can fight to keep the channels of truth open.
Hmm,
I think that's an extremely important part of it in this country, to fight for the freedom of the press and oppose all of this censorship that's coming along now, because if we don't know the truth, we cannot be effective.
yeah, I love that. Support independent journalism, trustworthy, real news. Yeah, where people, there's actually reporters on the ground who are digging up the truth. Really important. Joe?
We could get in touch with our Congress people and ask that military aid to Ukraine be based upon Ukraine making some type of effort to negotiate.
Well, since military aid is a key piece of what's keeping it going, maybe we could do even more than that. 'Cause as
Just,
long-
in other words,
Right.
ask our military leader, ask our Congress people to vote to stop military aid to Ukraine. I would just add to that. You were talking about, you mentioned that phrase, like, what would be the worst thing, or if I'm just kind of posing this to yourself, Rabbi Julie, or anybody who wants to answer it. And I guess my concern is if US military aid was totally stopped, with the realization that our military aid is continuing the war. If it was totally stopped, what would prevent Russia from saying, okay, now we got it clear, now we can just take over Ukraine? That's a concern of mine. That is a concern of mine.
Yeah, I mean, that's why going through the negotiating table makes more sense, because then you can have international peacekeepers stationed there, just kind of protect the peace. And it's not just an abandonment of Ukraine, it's a plan. So the best, it could also be a private communication to Zelensky. We're not just going to pour military aid in indefinitely. We will help rebuild the country, but this is going to come to an end. So you need to move to the negotiating table, come what may. Anybody who hasn't had a chance to speak, and then Paul. Ed, are you having thoughts there? You usually are. Wendy?
Sorry about that. I think that one of the ways that American Jews can be involved is to take a bigger look at the picture, big picture look, rather than just what is happening to Jews in Eastern Europe. I think it would be very powerful if Jews everywhere got involved in some of the things we're talking about. But we can't just look at how Jews are being affected. One of the things about that is that Russia has been kind to Jews at some points in history, and Ukrainians have not supported Jews at all times. So it's hard to back one country unilaterally.
Thank you. Ed?
Yeah, thank you, Julie. Wendy, your remarks remind me of the the reading you assigned, Julie, from the New Republic, where the author pointed out that there is a real populist residue of the Nazi anti-Semitism that was alive during World War II. On the one hand, Putin's claim that Russians are fighting a residue of Nazism sounds absurd, but on the other hand, within the complicated fabric of Ukrainian society, there is a real residue, as there is a residue emergent of anti-Semitism in the United States. So it's very complicated and puts the Jews in a very fragile position, I think.
Yeah, we did talk about that sort of legitimate anti-fascist, anti-Nazi history of Russia in relationship to the anti-Semites of Ukraine and elsewhere. And in some places in Ukraine, locally, 30% of the votes go to anti-Semitic parties, which is that's a lot locally, especially if you're in a parliamentary system where you have 30% of your governance system run by anti-Semites. That's pretty scary. So yeah, Ukraine does not have a great track record on anti-Semitism. And also Russia has been an aggressor on many fronts. So we understand what we're dealing with here, a mess. Any last comments here on any of this? Maria?
I was thinking about the negotiations and then thinking about World War II, the Great Yalta Conference, when the great leaders, was it Churchill, Stalin, and Roosevelt met, and they, cut up Europe and apportioned this one to that one. Well, especially the Polish, Ukrainian, Russia, all this little Slavic nations, how they did it. So it just, I don't know that we have that now. I mean, really great, leaders. I mean, I'm saying they were perfect. They all had flaws, but they had gravitas. And then I think, maybe one of the negotiating things, especially now that Zelensky is going to other countries. I was interested that he went to Saudi Arabia. It's like he's trying to reach out. I agree, maybe trying to find other people, leaders that could say, hey, like you said, we don't want to have a nuclear war, and, let's back up here a little bit. Ukraine, and then as far as negotiating, there's always something that one side has that they can negotiate with the other. So what are the things that Ukraine has that they can use to negotiate? They're a great land of grain, and they're also been discovering minerals. And of course, they have the nuclear reactors. Well, heaven knows what's going on there. And that's scary. But, something that they can bring, a resource that they can say, well, we can negotiate over with this, maybe we can make deals with this country. And then that country can say, well, we'll talk to Russia, but we could use, the resource that you have. We'll make deals with you. And we'll say to Russia, hey, Russia, if you back off a little bit, and Ukraine, you back off here. And then there's a really wild idea, which, is let the people in the Donbass and Crimea region, maybe let them vote again, but have some kind of international review of the election process and see what they want.
You should be running the world, Maria. The world would
Boy, there's not enough tranquilizers, antidepressants.
Oh my goodness. Okay, so we're going to start wrapping up because we have some closing things to do today. But just to say, we have not solved all the problems of this tragic war, but I hope we have deepened our understanding of the different interests and histories and also of how we as Jewish people can look at the situation, bringing our values to it. It still doesn't give us an easy strategy forward. We got to also hope that there are some people thinking well strategically behind the scenes who are not making the headlines and who are using back channels, and that there will be some more effective diplomacy happening. Because I think one of the things we have like adamantly come to in this course of study is that we have to go through the negotiating table. There is not going to be a military way to just vanquish the enemy here. And it could go on for many, many, many years. So anything we can do, anything our leaders can do, and let's hope there are plenty of people thinking about it behind the scenes and doing things behind the scenes to move towards that negotiating table. Yay. So, yes, I want to leave time today to count the Omer and to do a little bit of, do our Torah song, also to do a little brainstorming about what do people want to learn in the next series, just for a minute. And also to invite anybody who would like to join me this afternoon, who happens to be local in the area, at the RRC graduation at 2:00 at Rodef Shalom. I welcome you to come to that. It's always interesting. The new rabbinical students step forth as rabbis into the world. They get celebrated, and there's always some honors given to different people. So, and I think they feed you afterwards, although I don't know if they do that during COVID. But anyway, everybody's welcome. And some of us have gone in past years. I'm going this year because a friend is being honored, and anybody who wants to come is welcome. Road of Shalom at 2:00. Yes. So let's just do a few moments of evaluation for this shared time together, these 3 classes. If anybody wants to put anything in the chat box or just offer anything up, I want to collect some feedback of what went well, what would have been more helpful, those kinds of things. And going forward. You can also just write me individually an email if you'd like. Joe?
Well, one thing that I liked about these sessions is the idea that the person that is available to negotiate is the adversary, and you can't have the adversary be exactly the way you would like the adversary to be. The adversary is whatever the adversary is. That's the person or people to be negotiating with and trying to figure out what can be done. So it's kind of like facing the reality of things, because everybody wants to negotiate with somebody that would be, enjoyable and nice to negotiate with. You don't always have that option. So the reality of these discussions I found to be helpful.
Thank you, Joe. Anybody else want to comment? Iris.
I think Joe was right. What we were not having in the world situation right now is people who really want to fix things. Everybody's operating from their own point of view, and nothing's getting together.
Thank you, Iris. Anybody else? Okay, quick brainstorm on what are you interested in learning? And this goes into our education consideration with the committee that Diane Zilka leads. What are you interested in learning in the next fall for our next congregational series? With me. You can also email me. But any thoughts right now about what you'd be interested in learning, Teresa?
How about Judaism and corporate greed and the capitalism, like how Judaism, the Jewish community is helping heal the wounds of capitalism in our country today, kind of thing.
All right, thank you for that.
Something like that.
Anybody else got an idea? And I see some people are writing in the chat box. Okay, well, you feel free to communicate with me, and we're going to move into now counting the Omer. It's going to be the 46th day, which is 6 weeks and 4 days. And in the mystical tradition, which mostly grew out of Ukraine, so it's kind of very timely. This is considered to be eternity within majesty, which is Netzach Sheba Malchut. Netzach Sheba Malchut, eternity within majesty. I know when I saw that in the Hebrew calendar document, I was thinking about times that I've been to an exquisite art performance, like a dance performance or something, that was just so incredibly exquisite, is all I can say, that it felt like I was touching eternity. Like just, those kind of, the way art brings all kinds of, the arts bring just beauty into the world. And I know I've felt that sense of eternity within majesty at those moments. And if everyone wants to just take a moment and imagine, have you felt connected to something timeless and eternal through majesty, majesty meaning, beauty, glory, I don't know, maybe nature moments. And just to connect with that. And if you'd like to rise in body or in spirit, we will count the Omer together. I'm going to stay next to the microphone. It's like candle lighting, but it ends al Sfirat HaOmer. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu mitzvotav v'tzivanu al Sfirat HaOmer. Today will be the 46th day of the Omer, 6 weeks and 4 days. Amen. And we're going to sing our Torah learning song to end our class together. For our teachers and our students and the students of our students, we ask for peace and loving kindness, and let us say Amen. We ask for peace and loving kindness, and let us say Amen. We ask for peace and loving kindness, and let us say Amen. Chaverim, it has really been a pleasure to dive deep and discuss these difficult issues of the day with you. Very much engaging and meaningful to me. And I hope we continue to have these hard conversations about hard issues, but also good to be doing it together. Lots of love. Everybody show up for annual meeting on June 11th, if not before. We'll see you then and there. Bye-bye.